Heraclitus famously said that change is the only constant. This writing challenge will ask you to look at the world around you and reflect on how it has changed. It will ask you to write about a place as it is now and as it was then. This video is aimed at a range of ages and levels. It breaks down the writing process into at least two stages, the pre-writing and the writing. Whatever age or level you're at, you should watch and complete the pre-writing stage first. You should then watch the appropriate modelled answer before drafting your own response. This model will include a very specific skills focus. Once you've done this, you may decide, or be asked by a teacher, to redraft your work. You will find links to the different model answers in the video description below. Before writing, it is important to find a place to write about. You should make sure to pick a place which is safe and appropriate and where you're allowed to go, making sure that your parents or carers know or even accompany you. Once you find the place, you should take down information in any way which will help. This may include photos, video and voice notes, along with any written notes. You should then make a written plan. The next section of the video shows you how to go about doing this. As you can see from the pictures and video that was used at the very start of this video, I've gone to somewhere which is close to me and I've taken a few pieces of video and pictures which I will use to inspire me and to give me some reminders when I'm writing. To begin with, you should start by planning. Now for planning, you need to have actually gone to that place. When you go to that place, it's sometimes sensible to take a pen and some paper with you, or you might want to take some pictures or even videos or voice notes. All of these things are useful because it's important that you have some time reflecting on what you can see in front of you and absorbing the detail. Now, as you can see, I've described the shape of the valley cutting through the land. I've described the sky and the weather, and I've started to look at some of the details. And then when I've done that in the purple pen, you can see that I've gone back and I've started to add a few things that have occurred to me. For example, the valley, the technical name for that is a cutting. Once you've written about the now, that's where you should start thinking about the then. And again, this is where some research might be useful, but also some imagination. I've thought about the fact that the railway cutting, which now looks quite as if it's part of the landscape, would have looked different a couple of hundred years ago. It might have looked like it's a wound. It might have cut across the land. The embankments would definitely have looked different. They would have had far less greenery and foliage there. And a couple of other things have occurred because of the historical context. For example, the coal smoke. And at this point, I'm starting to reflect because I can see that actually I might want to draw attention to a contrast there. The fact that the cutting now looks like it's part of the landscape, like it belongs, whereas over a century, nearly 2 centuries ago, this might well have looked different. So it's not just a matter of noting what you see, this is part of the thinking process and thinking about how you're going to present this place now and then. This model answer focuses on getting your ideas together and organising them into paragraphs. So that's trying to keep the same topic in each paragraph. In the example you can see, I've started by talking about the time and the place. So I've said when it is, and then I've started talking about the place that it's in. So it's a cold morning, and then I've started describing the railway line. Then at this point, I try to give a bit of a picture, so a description of what the valley looks like, so that the person reading this gets an idea of that in their head. So I've almost tried to describe the picture that I would see in front of me. Now, as that piece of writing goes on, once I've described the picture, I then might decide to put in some actions, and in this case I've put in the train passing through. Sometimes you might decide to put people into your scene so that you can almost animate what's there. But the important thing, I think, is to set the scene first and to give us a picture in our heads as readers of what we should be seeing. Once I've done this, I've gone back and I've decided to do a little bit of editing. Looking back at my plan, I realised there's some mistakes, there's some bits I've missed. So for example, the valley should be the cutting and the sides of this railway cutting are called embankments. So I've corrected that and I've changed it. But then after a little bit more reflection, I've realised I want to put a few more things in. So I've put in some adjective detail, and I've also reread this first couple of sentences, and I've realised it didn't read well. There was a bit of repetition there, so I've changed the way it's phrased to make it sound better. And that's really important when you're doing a piece of writing like this. It's perfectly okay for it to be messy on the page, for there to be things crossed out and changed. That's part of the writing process. As you can see at the bottom there, I've decided that the train really should be in its own paragraph. So I've actually put 2 lines there to show that that should be a change of paragraph, and teachers will generally recognise that. As you can see in its model answer, the next part of what you're writing should then talk about then. It should talk about what the place used to be like. It does very similar things. It gives us a visual picture in our heads of what it looks like and focuses a little bit on maybe some of the things that have changed. So remember, the important thing here is you're trying to get your ideas together into clear paragraphs. So when there's a change in the time, the person or the place, you should be starting a new paragraph. For model answer number 2, the focus is using adverbs or modal verbs to talk about degrees of possibility. The first paragraph begins by setting the scene. Starts off by saying it's a cold winter morning, so it's giving us a time before it then gives us a place, where it introduces the railway. The second sentence describes what the railway looks like, in this case the deep railway cutting, and it tries to give us some details. So it describes the railway running along the cutting and then talks about the trees and bushes along the embankments. So this uses that vocabulary from the plan. Then there's some discussion, some detail about some of the trees. At this point you can see I've gone back and I've realised that I want to add a bit more detail at the beginning about the day. So I've mentioned something about the sky being bright but the air is cold, and also the dense bushes. This process of going back to your writing and adding things into it is something you should always be doing with creative writing. Creative writing is often quite messy. There's lots of crossings out and corrections, and that's why this is often quite a good one to draft on paper. As you can see, I've gone back to this and I'm correcting some of the style to make sure that it makes sense. Now we're ready to move on to the next section, which is to talk about then. And this is where the adverbs and the modal verbs are useful for showing that this is speculation. So it started off with, a century ago this might have looked very different. So the key word there is might, that modal verb. The cutting would surely have looked like a fresh wound across the landscape. So again, that word surely shows that this is speculation, that we're thinking about what it might have been like, but we don't actually know. And then if you look in that final sentence there's a bit of a comparison where it says, whilst the embankments are now teeming with life, they must have seemed bare. So that second paragraph is reflecting on what it might have been like. And if you see those words that have been circled, we've got some modal verbs and some adverbs of possibility. Model answer number 3 is focused on having a structural shift from the general to the specific. So this builds on some of the things that you will have seen in model answer number 2. As you can see, the example begins by setting the scene. It tells us where and when the scene is set. It also gives us some information about the weather conditions, which is always a useful technique for establishing mood. Immediately, this example has tried to move from the broader, more general picture into the close details by going on from talking about the cold winter morning in the sky to zooming in a little bit on a single bird. Then there's a shift into a new paragraph because there's a move in focus onto the railway line itself, and that's down in the railway cutting. Once again, when describing the trees and bushes, the focus moves in a little bit. It goes from talking about it being lined with trees and bushes to talking about the fact that some are lifeless and thin, and whereas others, the evergreens, remain or retain some signs of life. So again, there's this attempt to zoom in a little bit onto some specifics, which makes it a more convincing piece of writing. A very generalised piece of writing sometimes can feel unconvincing, especially if it commits the cardinal sin of using words such as everyone or everything and talking in overly general terms. The next part of this zooms in again, so there's another shift in the paragraph, and it zooms in on a small shrew scurrying around and hunting for scraps of food. As you can see, after this point there will be a further shift because you would then talk about the then as opposed to the now, and it's worth noting the way that this example also does what example 2 did, which is it uses modal verbs and adverbs of possibility to discuss some changes that might have happened and some differences that might have been there. Model answer number 4 focuses on using a non-linear structure and developing themes and ideas. This is a very sophisticated piece of writing, and by the nature of a piece of sophisticated writing, there's no set formula for it. A great deal of this hinges on your thoughts, reflections and ideas before you put pen to paper, as well as having a clear attitude or purpose behind your writing. In this case, this piece of writing is triggered very much by the reflection that the place that I've visited is somewhere which has undergone a great deal of change over nearly 2 centuries, and that in itself its arrival brought change with it. Immediately it goes into the reflection and into the comparison between the scene almost 2 centuries ago with the present day. The final section there develops this idea of social impacts and impacts on human beings of this piece of the environment. The clearest piece of advice that you can be given if you're looking to create a piece of writing like this is to do a lot of thinking and a lot of research before you put pen to paper, and be prepared to get involved in the drafting process, to change your ideas, to develop them. For further information and copies of presentations and resources, you can go to the following places. Thank you for watching and enjoy the challenge.